this session will help you in understanding different aspects of AWS services. So as our series serverless technologies we will be covering, so it's a part of this API gateway is a part of that series. And I hope by end of this series you guys will able to build something on serverless platform. Okay, so in case if you have any questions and all, you are free to put in Q&A section. So we'll try to address those questions maybe at the end of the session. Okay, or in case if you want to contact us by our LinkedIn or email ID, you can contact us using the same. Okay, so let's begin with today's session. So good evening everyone. Yeah, so before we move on to the actual Amazon API gateway, let's understand what is API. So API is application programming interface. So by this term, it may relate to different aspects like programming, then there is application, then there is interface. But to reduce these terms into short, then I would say that when you make a request, okay, when you make a request online to get live feed, it may be your weather reports, or if you are communicating with another person. So if you look at the background structure or the backend structure, there are these APIs who plays an important role to sending over the information from one system to another system. So even if we consider internet, on the internet there are multiple systems available. So if two systems need to communicate together, then there should be some secure way of communicating, or they should send a request and then they should get some response. So to make this entire process simpler, we make use of APIs. Okay, so this is the idea of API. And API gateway, Amazon API gateway works similar to this concept. Okay, so let's move on. So what is Amazon API gateway? So it's a fully managed service that allows developers to create, publish, and secure their APIs at any scale. So normally in the traditional approach, there is a lot of efforts that needs to be in place, or the infrastructure that is required to build an API is way too big. So in order to reduce those efforts and make this entire process of allocating resources and having that well-established communication, to ease the process of having that communication, Amazon, like AWS, came up with this Amazon API gateway. Okay, it also acts as a front door for the applications. Now, if you want to access any data, so there should be some security wherein that person needs to validate, okay, if this request is valid, or whether a valid person is sending this request, or it is just something like they actually really want to know, or is it something to do with the front-end portal that is making this request. So this is the front aspect of that backend, the underlying hardware which stores that information. Okay, so you can, even if you have any a complex logic, and if you want to work with changing or updating that data, so API gateway becomes an front door wherein you can just send a payload or the request, and in background automatically the business logic will execute and you will get a response. Okay, so this is the idea of API gateway. There are multiple types of Amazon API gateways which you can use. So first one is RESTful and HTTP APIs, wherein in case if you want to just access any service, like if you want to just access a lambda service, or if you want to use any AWS, any other service like dynamodb, then you can use an endpoint with HTTP. So this basically, HTTP API allows you to make a call to that individual service and work with that service, whereas RESTful APIs are like more efficient way to validate the methods. Then if you want to work with the payload or the query string, then all these aspects are covered under RESTful APIs. Okay. Now, second one is the WebSocket API. So normally we use WhatsApp or Facebook chat or any other chatting applications or similar streaming platforms like Netflix or all those media streaming platforms. So WebSocket APIs are actually a very efficient way to deal with this two-way communication. Okay, so if you want to access the content at much greater speed and you expect some constant interaction, that is, there is active interaction between the two systems or two different people, like the user and the host. So for those people, this WebSocket APIs plays an important role, and it will help you in making that two-way communication a little quicker and much easier. Okay, so these were the types of API gateways. So let's look at how actually this API gateway works. Okay, so if you see on the left hand side, there are multiple applications, or I would say different tools or different methods by which we make use of API gateway. So first one is, let's say, streaming dashboard. So if I consider the application where there is a two-way communication, as I mentioned earlier, the socket API, or if I consider the web or mobile applications where you are sending the real-time data, or if you want to pull some existing data from any of the DB throughout the world, like globally, if you are making a request. So for that, web applications or mobile application, you can use API gateway. Or if you have your IoT devices at home, like if you want to switch on any of the device and if you want to send that request over an API and make a log of all those requests, then for that also you can use API gateway. Then on another part, let's say I have an application which should not be accessed over the internet. That is, I have a private intranet or private network wherein I just want to communicate between different systems in my office. So if I consider a corporate center wherein people need to communicate and send the sensitive information within their network and not on the internet, then for that reason also I can make use of API gateway. So API gateway, whatever the results that we obtain can be cached. That is, we don't have to again and again make a third party call to the resources or the services which actually processing our underlying request. We can actually cache those requests, the responses, and then we will get request if the similar requests are made in the same domain. Okay. Another good aspect which we can integrate with is the Amazon CloudWatch. So if you remember in the previous sessions, we had covered what is CloudWatch. So just to revise on that, it basically helps you in keeping log or the metrics of how many requests or what are the number of requests that are happened on your site or all those things. So basically whatever requests that are sent to your APIs from which region, all those things can be monitored using CloudWatch. And at the end, if you look on the right hand side, then there are services which you can use along with the API gateway, like the lambda. So lambda, as we covered in the previous session, for business logic or to work with other AWS services. Then kinesis, this mainly used for real-time data, like if you want to work with IoT devices and all those things. Then if you want to store some information that will scale drastically and you don't have any underlying schema with you, then we can use dynamodb. And similarly, we can have VPCs, virtual private cloud, for having those inter office or under corporate center, that internal network for that those applications, we can make use of API gateway. Okay, so this was the overall flow. Now let's understand what are the different components that are available with the API gateway. So to understand this and get more better understanding, let's have a look at one of the API. Okay, so this API we actually built in SJI. Now this API is prepared for a demo purpose, so you may not see the actual business logic and all those aspects, but let's cover all the topics that are here on the left hand side, that is all these components. Okay, so first one is the resources. So in resources, what you see here is the endpoint or the URL, okay, wherein when you send a request, you need to have some unique identity that will help you, or that will give you an information about what resource you are making a call. So with these actions, you can create that resource. Like if I want to create a new resource, then I can just enter the resource name, the path. So this greeting is basically a path, the endpoint. Okay, so you can create that resource, you can give that path. So when you make a request, you can use that path to make a request. Then once we have the path, next thing is we need to send a request in different forms, like it can be a get method or post method. So for that, we can create our own method, like whatever we need based on the type of request that we need to send. So normally, I'm sure if you check in depth any of the application, like the weather reports, you will see there will be a get request or there will be a post request to send and store the information. So similarly, you can use these methods to create the request. Then there is a course policy. So basically, this is cross-origin resource access. Okay, so it may so happen that your API you need to restrict to your application or your portal, and you don't want your API to be used for any other purpose. So for that reason, you can block the request from the domains which are not there, or which are not it is not expected from other domains. So you can block it using course policy. Okay, next is the stages. So stages is basically something that will help you in defining, like if you have different environments for your APIs, like dev environment or production environment or testing and QA environment. So all those stages you can create here. See, as name suggests, prod, then stage information, then deployment type, the time you can select when you want to actually deploy. So this API gateway helps you in defining or sending those requests at different environments. So that stages actually helps us in determining and defining those stages, okay, those environments. Next is authorizers. So authorizers are something like if you want to validate whether if that user has a permission to send that request, like if I'm not logged in and if my API should not allow guest users to send a request to the service, then for that reason we make use of authorizers. Also, you can validate if the user is valid or if he is a robot using lambda function and other available tools. Okay. Next is gateway responses. So basically, when we get a response, okay, so sometimes it may so happen that we may not have a permission to access a particular service. Okay, so those that permission related issue we may not understand by looking at the result that we get when we send a request. So for that method, if you want to modify the response, like if the status code is 403 and if I just want to update the response header, or if I want to just update the template saying that okay, this is the original message that I don't have access, that is access denied, plus why I don't have access, like you are a guest user. So if I want to customize this message, then this gateway responses actually helps us in defining that, to give more idea about what is that error. Similarly, there are multiple different reasons or different responses that you might get when you make an API request. Okay, so when you work with actual APIs, you can test this out and customize those responses as per your need. Okay, next one is the models. So models basically helps you in defining what will be the request and how you will so if you look at this, the schema, this schema is basically helping me to understand what is the type of request that I'll get. Like if it's a string, if it's a number, if it's a if it's a something extra like the object, or if it's an array, then all those things I can define in this model, and ultimately while working with the API I can use this schema. Okay, we will check exactly how we can use this schema in later on stage when I'll give a demo of one of the API. Okay, similarly response works the same way. As you process the request schema, same we need to process the response schema. So whatever response that we get from the service, if we need to modify it in such a way that at the user level the user will understand how what is the response, what like if we give a simple object, and if that object doesn't give a relevant information like what that object is all about, then it is like an ambiguous response, and we may not at the user level he may not understand it. So for that reason we can format the schema if it's a complex object, okay, in the simpler form. So this is for that reason models are used. Then resource policies are something to do with the IAM. Now if you want to restrict the API within your corporate network, then for that reason resource policy comes in handy. Now in documentation you just define what is your API is all about, how other people or other developers can use your APIs or modify your APIs. So all that documentation you can work with in this documentation block. Then next is the dashboard. Now how many requests are made, how many API calls, as I mentioned earlier, the latency, how much time it took for request to get processed, how many integrations were done to your APIs, what are the status codes that you received or the error codes that you received. So that graph you'll get here. Okay, so these are the different available components that you can use with your API. Okay, so so then there is a usage plan. You can just calculate what will be the overall cost that might incur in the number of requests that you make. Then if you want to restrict your APIs with the keys that if there is a key in the request, then only fulfill that request. So for that reason API keys are there. Then client certificates, if you want to put SSL or secure end-to-end encryption, if you want to put, then for that reason you have client certificates. So these are the different components that normally comes along with the API gateway. Okay, so next let's understand what is the inner process, the underlying process that happens in the API in much deeper level, okay, at API level. So if I am selecting any request, okay, that any basically means any of the method like get, post, put, okay, any of this method. So if I am sending that request through the postman or any other site from where I am making a request, so first block is method request. So method request basically allows us to check the authentication, the type of authentication, if there is a key or if there is any user need to log in, and all those requests are actually validated under method request. Okay, so if we check in deep here, so as I mentioned, the authorization, the validator, like if the request is valid or it is not from the robot, and all those things are checked. Then if the key is there, so you can actually set if the key is required or not. Okay, similarly the query strings, then HTTP request headers, as I mentioned earlier, the body and all those aspects. Okay, next is the integration request. So in the integration request we have different methods that actually help us in making use of different services offered by AWS. Like in this API, I have made use of lambda function for business logic. Similarly, there is one more API where I have made use of AWS service. Okay, so we will look that API a little later. Similarly, there is a VPC. If it's a network, the corporate center, then I can actually define which function to call with this API, the lambda function. So right now you may not understand what the lambda is, but for the next session we will be diving deep into what is lambda function, how you can use lambda function. Okay, so please attend the next session as well to understand what is lambda and how you can use lambda. So for now you can just understand that lambda is just a function or a method that is called with this endpoint. Okay, so this greeting is just making another function call in the AWS. Okay, so we can set a default timeout, or we can increase the timeout. Like if our overall processing time is a little bit higher, then we can update this timeout as per that maximum request. Okay, so this is basically handles the execution part where it should send a request. Okay, the integration request. Next is the type of service that is used. So if you see here, this is in vertical form, so it may not look properly, but this will actually give you an idea about what is that resource that is being used in that API. So in our case, we have used the lambda, so it is here. What is that function name? It is here. Similarly, we have integration response. So whatever data that is processed here is sent to the integration response to format it in such a way that it is further used on your site. Okay, so for that reason, integration response is used. And the last is just to send that response and process that response. Okay, so if we check here, so we have a response schema that is defined with application JSON. So I'm expecting that the response that I'll get will be of JSON form. So for that reason, I'm defining a content type of the response body. Okay, so these are the flow parts, I would say, the underlying different processes that takes place in the API. Okay, I hope this gave good idea. Okay, so let's move on to the settings which are available for APIs. So we can define the endpoint types, that is regional, edge, or private. So regional is basically now if you see in a service, so we have these different regions. Okay, so while working with these regions, we need to know these resources what we are using. So these resources are actually provision under these regions. Okay, so every time if you create any of the API, it will be limited to this region. However, you can use it in different regions by using different methods. Okay, so so these regional endpoints are normally used when your requests are defined in a particular region. Let's say I want to have my API access only in US East, that is in Virginia. So I can just use that API in US East, or if I want to make a call to the API in the Mumbai region. So basically it will serve in entire India. Okay, similarly if I want to use another API to be served in Singapore, so it will actually serve all the users in Singapore. Okay, similarly there are many regions which we can use while working with these APIs. Okay, then there is a edge endpoint. So basically edge is like enhancing the reach of this API. So if I'm creating this API which is in particular region, and if I want to serve that API throughout the world, then this edge endpoint helps us in using this API at much higher level. Okay, so we will be making use of CloudFront that will by default will be used with edge to provision or make that API available at different users all over the world. Next is the private API, as I mentioned. So if I want to use this API in limited to only one office, corporate office, so in my own network, if I want to use that API, then this private endpoint actually helps me to deal with that. Okay, then there is something called as default endpoint and custom endpoint. Now it might so happen that so if I go to settings, okay, so if you see here, I am getting this endpoint. Okay, so this endpoint is basically generated by the Amazon. Okay, so AWS generates a endpoint and it gives me, so I don't have to actually worry about creating a separate endpoint and all those things. Okay, so this is a default endpoint that we can use while working with the APIs. But let's say for some reason you don't want to use this endpoint, and if you want to, you want to use your own custom endpoint, or you want to define and use your own domain, sub part of that domain, so then you can disable this service and you can use this own endpoint, okay, while serving this custom endpoint. So even if you go to these stages, okay, so in stages, if you see, there is an invoke URL. So this is that endpoint, then slash what is that stage, and ultimately the resource that we want to use. Okay, so this is the type of endpoint, the invoke URL. So we will be checking this URL in some time. Okay. Then there is a API key source, so from where this request comes and all those things. Then there is a compression, like if you want to optimize your API, if you want to encode your API, so for that reason this settings actually comes in handy. So you can just set those headers, or encode your content and all those parts of that settings of that API. Okay, so now let's see some of the APIs and let's see how it actually works. Okay, so when you build an API, when you have a resource, like I have this resource named the greetings, and then I have this lambda proxy. So lambda proxy is nothing but a lambda function. So if I want to just go to that lambda function, so I have some code with me. So this is very plain code. So if you see, I have printed here received event, the type of event, and ultimately I'm setting a code that is status 200. So 200 is the normal status code when the request is valid and you get a output process. So if you visit any URL, so the people who have joined now, if you visit any URL and if you go to the network tab of your browser, okay, when you click on inspect, like if I click, so let's say I am going to GitHub and I am doing inspect. So if I go to see, so if you see here the status of this request, that is recent activity, top repositories, I'm getting this status, right? So these are basically the requests that are sent over an internet. Okay, so similarly these APIs will be are made such that you send those requests to those APIs, and then if that API is processed, then you will get this status code as a 200. Okay, so yeah, so if my status is valid, then so considering our logic is processed here in this step, and we are getting the output, and we are sending that output. Okay, so I'm just sending that output in the body of this request. So I'm just dumping your hello from your new amplify Python lambda. Okay, so this is just a text that I want to see on the application part. So let's say I want to see a get method. Okay, and I am testing this API. So if you see here, I am sending a request to this resource greeting. I'm getting the response as status 200. That means my request was successful. And this is the latency. That means how much time it took. Like it took 408 milliseconds. Okay, then what is the body, the response body? So whatever body that we send here is we received here. Okay, so this can be a different data, a different form of data. Then if you see the response headers, you will find more information, like what type of response that you get. So whatever responses, the headers that I have sent, like this header, origin header, method, post, options, post, get. So all those things are available with me here. Okay, similarly, you can create your own API with what response headers you want according to that. This log section is basically helps you in understanding what happens at different levels when you send a request. Okay, so if you remember in this slide, this API flow, we had this method request, then integration request, then intermediate the function call, then integration response and the method response. So this log basically gives you more depth information about at what happens at every level. So the query string, the request headers, the body before transformation, that is the integration request, then when you hit the request URI. So all this log information is basically helps you in understanding what actually happens at your API level. And if you see the endpoint response body, okay, the response body that you got, the status code, then transforming that response after transformation. So you only want to see the response, what I get in the body. So for that, you get that information. And finally, if it's a successful or it is rejected. Okay, so this is like more information about this. Let's move on to another API. Okay, so this basically, if I show you here, okay, yeah, so if I go to this lambda function, so let's move on to little bit, step little higher. Now, if I want to use a database, dynamodb, that is no SQL database, no SQL database, I want to scan this code. You can ignore because this may be a little bit technical. So we will look more aspects of this in maybe future sessions while I'll be covering the lambda session in the next upcoming session. So this normally making a call to the table, it is getting me a response and I'm then returning that response, and then I am actually sending this response to this API. Okay, so let's just see if this code works. Okay, so I am making a GET request. Okay, I just want to pull all the records that are available in DynamoDB which is pertaining to the leaves. Okay, so I'll just test this. Okay, so it seems that we have made a successful request. Our status code, as I mentioned, the latency, so basically how much time it took, then the body, the items that are there in DynamoDB. So first we have status, then we have leave ID, then the name, the test, whatever that is stored in the DynamoDB. Now, if you want to check this data, okay, if it really exists in so if you see, I have this information with me, the leave ID, name, test2, and the status. So if we check here, we have the same information. Okay, so it is like directly pulling the information from DynamoDB using this lambda function. Okay, so this is something similar you can say to MySQL connection. Now, if you guys are working with PHP and if you are making a request to MySQL database, you are making a connection, then you are making a query, then you are getting the result. So this is something similar to that. Okay, let's move on to the final API. That is, if you see here, I don't have lambda proxy. So if you look at here, I have lambda proxy, that is my function is connected with the lambda, but whereas I have directly connected my function with DynamoDB. Okay, so in integration request, you will see here AWS service. I am selecting the region. I am making selecting the service which I want to make call to. So there are multiple services available here. Now, depending upon your application, you can select different service and you can make use of this API feature. Okay, then I'm explicitly mentioning here what type of request, that is I'm making a post request. Okay, so it is important that you define the type of method while making a action. Okay, if your action doesn't support get request, then this API call will break. Okay, it is also important that you put or select execution rule. Now for my API to access DynamoDB, it is important that I give enough permissions for that API to access DynamoDB. So this actually you can define using IAM that we covered in previous sessions. Okay, then finally the mapping template. Okay, so now it might so happen that I may send a request. Okay, but it might be difficult for that application or the DynamoDB to understand this what type of actually which in DynamoDB which table I want to access. So we nowhere actually made that. Like if I go to test, so if you see here, I am making a request, get request, I am passing query strings or headers, but nowhere I have mentioned that I want to make a call to leaves API. Okay, I want to use leave table. Okay, so for that reason it is important that in application JSON I mention what the table which I want to make a call to. Okay, so in this case, in this API I want to make a call to leaves table. Okay, so that is some so if you remember, I had spoken about models. So this is actually the mapping template or the model that you can use to so there are multiple ways. So there are different templates or these models, the empty or the error that you can select, which will be used in the template. Okay, so which will be sent in the request. Okay, so let's just see if we are getting any information from DynamoDB. So if you see here, we got these two records. Okay, and if you compare it with this API, okay, yeah, so if you compare it with this API, we got the items plus we got the count plus we got the scan count. Okay, so there is this additional information which is available with us when we make a call with the lambda function. But in this case, we are directly making a call to that service, and that service itself taking care like what is the response that we might get. Okay, now there are multiple things that are actually, if you see this, all these things are skipped. But you may wonder why these things are skipped, because in the lambda function when we send a response, we actually send the entire response, that is the data that was processed, the entire basically the available records. But in this case we just get an array, and in that array we are getting this object, right? So there is another function that I have explained here. So if you look at method response, so in the integration response, so if you see here, there is another model that is mapping templates. So here what I am doing, I am basically looping through the results that I get, that is the items. Okay, so if you see here, this is something to do with the lambda. So we are getting this data, then we are getting this as a plain form. So I am just modifying the response such that I am pulling one by one all the records, all the items, then I am formatting this template, and in the integration response I am sending this information in the form of array, and in that array I am storing it as a object. Okay, so this basically integration response basically helps us in creating that form how we want at a user level. Okay, and in method response we are just sending that application response by allowing access control allow origin. Okay, if you don't set this, then you may get the error like the course policy, or you don't have access to this resource and all those things. So it is important that you enable the course policy in the response as well. Okay, so this was the third type of API. So I hope this gives you an enough idea. So tomorrow, if you want to work with creating these APIs, then I guess this information should actually help you. And by a few clicks, you will be like able to build the APIs. So I guess the people who join this session, it will really help you in creating the APIs. Okay. So these were the sample APIs. So next, let's understand what are the features and usabilities. So this API gateway actually helps us in the application which are like containerized applications. Like if you want to use a Fargate or something to do with ECS, like the elastic containers. So in those cases, you can use this API. Then if you want to work with serverless applications, like if you are building or if you are using Amplify, then with Amplify, if you want to build an API, so you can use these HTTP or REST APIs and make a call to those AWS services. Then if you want to work with web applications, like if you just want to store the information in DynamoDB, like if you want to, let's say I'm working with e-commerce site, and if I want to keep track of how many users looked at my a product, or how many visitors actually came to my site, and how many checkout happened on my e-commerce site. So all those things, all that information can be sent over an API from that web application. Then if you look, this is a very efficient API development. Like you don't have to actually worry about the infrastructure. Everything is taken care for you. You just need to, build an API and just check how many requests that API can handle. The overall throttling, like how much load that API can take. Also in Amazon API Gateway, there are no minimum fees or startup costs. Like if you are building this API and if you are not using this API, then you won't be charged anything to make to build this API. Only when there is a request made in that API, that if you are consecutively making some millions of requests, or there are multiple users who are making the request, then only you will be charged. Okay, so it's as we look, or as we know that in the serverless, you pay for what you use. So this API gateway actually uses that model. Again, as I mentioned earlier, you have the CloudWatch and the monitoring system. So it is quite easy to know like how many requests came, what were the fault, or what were the invalid request, or how much time it took to process that request. So everything you can check it in the graph. Then you have more flexibility while working with the security. Like if you want to use a key, or if you want to use a IAM access, or if you want to use user authentication. So there is a flexibility of selecting the security controls. Then now if there is suddenly rise in the traffic for your API to process, then it actually automatically scales. So you don't have to actually worry about provisioning more resources and making use of more hardware. So it is by default handled by AWS. So you don't have to actually worry about the number of resources that are required to process your API. And the last part is you can automate your API. That means if you want to migrate your API from one AWS account to the new AWS account, then you can make use of something called as SAM that we had looked in the previous sessions, like serverless application model or cloud formation template. So you can make use of those templates and define what that API will do, what are the requests that will be sent, what will be the response that will be sent over that after you process any API or business logic. Okay, so that automation actually is available with you if you want to work with this API. Okay, so these are the features and advantages which are available with API Gateway. Now, to give a real-time case scenario, this is just a simple workflow that I have designed. So, and actually we use this model for some of our projects. So there is a user, then he sends a request to API gateway. So if you see the endpoint that I had mentioned, so in that endpoint, we are making a call to that endpoint. Then there is a lambda function. So this lambda function then making a call to dynamodb, and we are getting some some data from dynamodb. At the same time, whenever there is a write request, that is, if we are adding a new record to dynamodb, there is again an event handler that processes that information again in the lambda. Okay, so the top lambda is used to process that data that is being updated in dynamodb, and then we are sending that information to the user using SNS or any other service like emailing SES, sending an email to the customer saying that okay, we have processed this information. So this is just a basic idea of workflow, what you can expect while working with the API gateway. Same way you can have IoT devices or different sensors. So those sensors you can use to send a request to that API and then further process it. Okay. Yeah, I think this is it. So I hope this gave you an overall idea about how the things work and how you can make use of API gateway, okay, while working with your applications.